really pleased that Mercer and Bryan and ICLE have come together to put on this fantastic symposium. Because I am honorary consul in Denmark, I did want to take this opportunity to recognize my colleague, Mr. John Parkinson, who's here, so we have a European presence. I'm not speaking today, but I do have to put in my 2 cents worth for Denmark and Europe. There are a lot of interesting things going on in trade, but I ask everyone to remember that here locally that 62% of our inbound foreign direct investment comes from Europe. And from Denmark's standpoint, I'd like to let everyone know that their shipping is the #1 customer of the Georgia Ports Authority. So a lot to talk about Asian Day, which is important, but don't forget Europe. We've got a fantastic panel here today. We're going to start off with Professor Penelope, who's with the Institute of International Business and Director of the China Research Center in Georgia State. She's going to talk about how economies can promote the middle class and avoid the middle income class. I believe that's correct. Then we're going to hear from James Reed, the Senior Vice President and Chief Legal Counsel at YKK, which of course is very important to us here in Macon. It's the first Japanese subsidiary in the state of Georgia, and they have a manufacturing facility here in Macon and also down in Dublin in Orange County. We'll hear from him on the manufacturing perspective. Now, from our nation's capital, we'll finish up with Lynn Van Buren, who's an attorney with Bryan in Washington. She's going to be discussing legal issues, export control laws, regulations, and even traffic in arms, which ought to be interesting. And speaking of arms, because I do represent Denmark, I have a very unique gavel. If anybody gets too long here, so without further ado, you start us off with us, Bryan.
I'm a little worried about the camel. So can we want this slide? Well, good morning. Thank you for having me, and I'm pleased to be here to learn about various aspects of international trade and the legal piece. As an economist, we look at international trade from a much different perspective, although I understand the rules do make the markets, and that's a very important point. My personal interest in trade is I love going to ports, partly because trade is such a powerful aspect of economic development in our economies that just looking at the ports you get a sense of that place. So, for example, when I visited Singapore in the early 1980s, the first thing my husband and I did was find a boat that would take us out and look at what that port looked like. And even then, that port was very, very impressive. And of course, today, it's multiples of that. But there's just great ports around the world, in Kaohsiung, and Busan, and in Shanghai, of course, and in Savannah, of course. And so for our spring break this year, we're going to the Panama Canal. So this is serious. Piece of what I look at. In terms of the macro high level of trade, when we look at economies and openness to trade, there's a very, very high correlation. So more trade, more growth. Now there's a lot of debate about what the connections are between that, and a lot of theory that we use to connect them. But it's a very, very powerful piece of specialization that leads to economic growth. On the macro side, then, more trade, more development, more growth. On the micro side, though, there's always winners and losers. Right? With every trade policy, there's going to be those who benefit from that policy and those who are hurt. And that's when you need the trade negotiators and the alternatives. Right, so they're all connected in that way. What I thought I would do today is talk about some trends in the global economy, since the areas where we will do more trade and more investment will be the economies that are growing and developing. But what we see today is kind of two possible trends. One is that there's a growing middle class, and that's driving a lot of the business decisions. But on the other hand, we see some economies that are starting to stall, or that have stalled for quite some time, and they're being left behind. And so one of the projects that I'm working on at the moment is looking at why the successful economies are succeeding, and what the other economies might do to make sure that they don't stay behind or fall too far behind. And of course, in the middle of the story, there's China. So that is a piece of the story that I'll talk about today. So just some graphics on this growing middle class phenomenon that we've all heard about. These are from the bottom here, from the Brookings Institute, about the consuming middle class, that by 2030, we're looking at $56 trillion, and almost 5 million people will join the consuming middle class and drive where business goes. The graphic with the map shows most of that is driven by Asia. Right? It's not only Asia, but the expected growth of the middle class in Asia is enormous. China, of course, #1, but India right behind, and Indonesia as well. Now, of course, South Korea, Taiwan, these places are doing well and have very important middle classes, but they're just smaller. Right? They get dwarfed in some sense. But if you put it all together, then Asia does look like the next major business market. And again, this is another graphic of that. On the other hand, we have increasing competition in the global economy, which is hurting some areas. So we have the elephant in the room, which is China, comes into the game with low cost, labor-intensive kinds of products, which then makes it very hard for the latecomers to compete, right? Because they're really inexpensive and going up actually in terms of quality, which we heard already in the first panel. So on the low end of the trading scale, countries are having a lot of trouble to compete with China. At the same time, China's gone up the value chain in many aspects, and so we have very sophisticated products that are also coming out of China. So on the high end, these other countries are also getting squeezed. So some of this middle income problem comes from this increased competition from China primarily, but also some from other places as well. So we have this graphic from Bloomberg, I think is quite interesting. On the horizontal axis, we have the years since middle income was reached, and we have just a couple of examples. But here, so it's 0 to 60. So we're looking at Mexico, Brazil, and Peru, which are still middle income countries after 60 years. And then we look at some of the Asian countries here, Taiwan and Korea, which within 25 years went from low income through the middle income up until to the high income. So you do see this different growth trajectories. And part of it will affect where trade happens, and of course where business will happen. In the blue, we have China, which is in speculation. The projection is at current growth rates that China will break out of the middle income and reach high income in the next decade or so, but that's a question mark. Right? That's not necessarily for sure. So success in the past doesn't necessarily mean success in the future. China's big, it will matter, but we don't know for sure what that growth trajectory will look like. So let me just show you some case countries here, just as examples. We have Ireland and Singapore, which have been very, very successful. So they're our model countries, so to speak. And look at how they've achieved their accomplishments is instructive. Malaysia is struggling a bit, but has done fairly well. Peru is again one of those who's been stuck in the middle income trap. And Chile has done very well in terms of income per capita. But if you look at it from other points of views in terms of its capabilities, it doesn't look quite as good in terms of the future. And then we have China. So on a per capita basis, GDP per capita, you see Singapore and Ireland are the top two, the red and the purple, and everyone else is further down. And all growing, but it's not a convergence by any means, right? So some are doing better than others. Now, China, of course, is one of the big question. In this chart, we're looking at the middle-income countries relative to the high-income countries with the dotted line, and that's without China. So in that sense, without China, those middle-income countries have kept their position at about 20% of the high-income countries, but they haven't gotten better than that, right? They're kind of stuck there. But if we take middle-income countries relative to China, which is the dark line, then they've lost ground tremendously to China. Right? So the share, they used to be 7 times richer than China, and now on average they're actually below. So it is an awesome impact on what's happening in this global growth scenario. On the other hand, China's slowing. Right? These are quarterly growth rates for China from 2010 till the mid-2013, our last numbers that we have. And so here we see, sometimes we call this a soft landing in the Chinese context, because some growth slowing isn't a bad thing. We don't want it to crash. On the other hand, the question is, how far will it float down? In China, the debate is, are we in the middle income trap? Right? Is this our time to get stuck, right, in that space? So while everyone outside of China is worried, China's going to compete the pants off of us, right? China's going to take over the world. China owns U.S. bonds. I mean, all of this. Within China, the perspective is quite different. What they see are many, many barriers to growth, at least future growth. I mean, obviously they've done well. They have this growing middle class, but they're looking at the future and wondering, can we keep this up? And what will it take to continue? One of the things that we see from the success of Ireland and Singapore is that they focused on what we call capabilities, both social capabilities and firm capabilities. And this is it's deliberate government policy to emphasize education, to emphasize building infrastructure, to build national innovation systems, and really maintain the ability to move up the value chain and be innovative. And everybody wants that today. Everyone talks about being a knowledge economy in order to compete, but it takes very deliberate steps in order to make that successful in most situations. And Singapore and Ireland have been very deliberate about it. If we look at Chile as a counterexample, they have not. They've done very well because of natural resources, and their income per capita is approaching high income. But in terms of long-term capabilities of their own firms and of their labor force, it doesn't look very good at all compared to the others. So it's interesting. China, it looks pretty good in some of those, by those capability measures. So China's situation may be different, right? Their problem may be something different. So these countries have to have the resources in order to invest in these capabilities. Clearly, Ireland and Singapore have very high savings, Malaysia as well, and China also, right? And the others are lower. Foreign investment, Ireland and Singapore are very high, the rest are somewhat lower than the share of GDP. As a measure of moving up the value chain, here I have high-tech exports as a percentage of manufacturing exports. You can see at the bottom, we have Chile and Peru. They're not in the game by that kind of a measure. The other countries, Malaysia, Singapore, and Ireland, have done quite well. And China, you can see, has moved up in terms of that high-tech area. If we look at the high-tech service exports as a share of service exports, Ireland wins the game on this one. Very, very high. And the others are lower. And Peru, of course, is at the bottom. 1 minute. Okay. And so if we look at R&D, another measure of investing in these capabilities. Again, we have Singapore and China. China's up there, Singapore and Ireland are up there, and the others are not. So to think about where the future is going to be for growth and for trade and for foreign investment, I think it's helpful to look at what government policies these countries have and look at some of these indicators of more advanced kinds of growth rather than just income per capita measures. So I'll stop.
Good morning, my name is Jim Reed, and hopefully I can drive. Okay, so I appreciate being here. I'm not a professor. I'm not an expert in international law, but I do work for an international company. And so I guess that's why Joel invited me, and he promised me I didn't have to write a paper, so I said, yes, this would be great. I work for YKK. We have a factory here that we're very proud of, but we do a lot of things. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about us, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit more about issues that we deal with down in the weeds. I mean, it's great to be here to hear about these broader global issues. But also down in the weeds, we kind of deal with just a issue by issue thing. And if you're going to practice law, or if you're dealing with clients that are having these issues, they can impact them just as much as any broad tariff issues. We make zippers here in Dublin. We make architectural products, but we're actually 3 companies. I'm going to tell you about that so we can get to the other part, and that is the machinery and engineering aspect. We make the machines that make our stuff, okay? And the trick to being successful is because we did that, all right? So we're in 71 countries around the world right now. If you went to a YKK factory here in Macon, and then you went to the one in Malaysia, or the one in Bangladesh, or the one in Vietnam, they would look exactly the same. If you went to one in China, it would look the same, except it'd be much bigger. But and we make a lot of little stuff, okay? And there's a lot of technology that goes into making each of these little things. And we make these little things, little snaps and buttons, all little hardware that may go on apparel. But an important aspect of that is also the machinery. And then those components end up being attached to a lot of different products, not just apparel, but all different types of things, including medical, a lot of automotive. We talk about, I have this slide up here because I wanted to talk a little bit about how we react to emerging markets challenging manufacturers in the United States. So we came to Macon in 1973 here, and these are YKK zippers being made, okay? And at the time, the U.S. competitors were making these zippers. And these zippers then went into apparel that was being made in the United States. Of course, that changed drastically, right? This is imported products with zippers over that same period of time. And as we gained market share in the U.S., the industry just completely disappeared. So we were challenged by emerging markets just like every other U.S. manufacturer was challenged by emerging markets. And, you know, the point is, industry is going to move. We move. We're in 71 countries because our apparel customers are in those places, and we need to follow them around. We need to make our little things next to them because you don't want to ship zippers from Macon to Vietnam. It doesn't work so well there. They're going to move there because the low cost, of course, and you just can't get around that. So you can either be afraid of that or you can embrace it. And so U.S. manufacturers are looking to export into these emerging market countries, and I'll kind of focus in our region, which is Latin America. So if you're a U.S. manufacturer like YKK or like any other manufacturer, you're not going to send a lot of finished goods to Latin America, but there's going to be a lot of little parts, little things that you want to send to these factories here for their lower cost production, and this is where we are in North and Central America. You're not going to send that, but you are going to send some important parts out there as you're exporting. And we do a lot of exporting out of Macon to all over the world. This is brass wire that we smelt. And what you're exporting is not the complete finished product here. You might be exporting the important part of the part that's difficult to make. And then you're going to send it to your factory where the low-cost assembly is done. And when you do that, you also have to send equipment. These are different pictures of different types of equipment. And it can be any manufacturer, but this can't be a unique thing. So when you send your components over for finishing into your emerging market, you can't just send those components. You're going to also send them important things with those components. Okay? And you're also going to have to send people down there to show them how to do it. So you've got a lot of important stuff that's going down there, and you've got to protect it. And you've got a lot of risks that are facing you. And I'm not really even going to deal too much with intellectual property risk because I think it's covered in other areas. But when you've got people, you've got know-how, and you've got technology, and you're a manufacturer, you know, as Greg mentioned earlier, you've got to keep those trade secrets. You don't patent that a lot. You keep that as trade secrets, and you want to make sure that doesn't walk out the door when you go into those emerging countries. And when you're bringing people, you got to make sure they're safe. So you've got to deal with these big threats. And the big threats is you're thinking about your people. You've got your extortion threat and your threat of violence. Okay? And San Pedro Sula in Honduras earned the benefit of being the most dangerous city in the world this year. I was reading up on it because I know a lot of our employees have to deal with that. 17,500 small businesses in Honduras were forced to close last year because of extortion. 28% of people living in El Salvador have been held up at gunpoint. So I mean, it is an extremely dangerous place to operate. And so when you think about, oh, we're going to go down to El Salvador and it's so much cheaper and you can have all these employees, you have to deal with the fact that your manager may disappear one day. You know, or just your operators can't get to work. Or how do you drive them to work? Because there's no street lights and they're walking in the dark. What do you do with your women who are working in El Salvador and walking a mile in the streets with no street lights and they start the shift at 4 a.m.? You know, so you have bus services and you start to think about things. And these are fun things that lawyers get to deal with that aren't exactly dealing with the law, but it is specific, you know, to making operations work down there. So that's one point. The other one was, it is technology or the risk of theft, because you can't have all your own people there. So you're going to be hiring people, you may not know them so well. What if your accountants, and I speak from personal experience, what if your accountants who look very good on their resumes turn out to be criminals and steal your money? And you come at it from a very U.S. perspective, you're going to be at a great disadvantage. The first problem is you can't find them. You physically can't find them. They can just disappear into a small city, even a small city. If you can find them, then you can't get the police to act, because theft is really a civil matter in a lot of these countries. I wish I had more time to talk about that, but if you can get the police to act, how do you get the courts to act? And if you can force the courts to act, how do you make sure the guy stays in jail? And so these are all issues you have to deal with on a daily basis when you're operating in some emerging countries. But I wanted to spend the rest of the time focusing on that equipment, because that's your secret sauce. You know, if you're going to be a successful U.S. manufacturer exporting to emerging market countries, I guess there are some manufacturers like Seven or the jeans guys who can send expensive product to China. But for the most part, most manufacturers are making things that are less expensive. You have to use the lower cost of the foreign worker to finish off the product. So, but you're sending off that stuff. And you make a mistake if you send that stuff off with the assumption that you can protect that stuff under the same rules that you're protecting that stuff here. A lot of important things can happen. For instance, you may have a partner and you may lease them this equipment, and you may have a very good, confidentiality provision in your lease that says, and don't move this equipment. For goodness sake, don't move this equipment from this spot. And they may intend to respect that. But for instance, say you're doing it in Mexico, and you have a NAFTA, which is a certificate of origin, or we call it impedimento in Mexico. You have a piece of paper that says that piece of equipment is down there under NAFTA, so you don't have a tariff on it. But you actually need to go down there and make sure your partner or your subsidiary has all those pieces of paper. And that's not a given, because when the foreign agency comes in, when the Mexican agency comes in to inspect, they're going to want to see all the pedimentos. And if they don't see the pedimentos, they will seize that equipment. And once they seize that equipment, then your margins, just quickly. And what's interesting as well is a U.S. manufacturer coming out of the U.S. with a foreign subsidiary may actually be disadvantaged, in particular by their code of conduct or their compliance requirements, or even just trying to maintain compliance with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, because those government agents will come and they may not find any problems the first time, but they're going to come back and they're going to find another problem. And then you're going to solve that problem. And then they're going to come back a few weeks later, and then you're going to solve that problem. And then they're going to be wondering why you don't get it. Why you don't understand that if you just paid them a little bit of money, they would leave you alone. But if you're a U.S. company, you can't play that game. And so you may be a bit disadvantaged from that perspective. The other one is if you've got a foreign partner, and let's say they don't pay all the taxes they're supposed to pay in their foreign jurisdiction. Or let's say they're not paying bribes. Or let's say they just go bankrupt. That government agency may seize all your stuff to satisfy those debts. All your secret sauce is here. You can make things better than anybody else because of all the technology and know-how that you have right there. And the government agency not knowing that, or not really caring that this is a piece of leased equipment sitting in a foreign factory, is U.S. property. They're not going to care about that, so they're going to seize everything, and then they're going to auction it off. And you will have competitors that know about this. We paint this equipment, this ugly color of green, so that we can see it when we go to other factories. Another point is when this gets old and obsolete, even from your perspective, from the U.S. manufacturer's perspective, when you want, it's obsolete, so you want to trash it, you actually will probably have to send it back to the U.S. to destroy it. Because if you destroy it in some of these emerging market countries, the guy will come with a truck, and he will sign every piece of paper you want him to sign, and then he will take it to his place, he will refurbish it, and then he will sell it. And so these are little things that pops up all the time if you're just a regular practitioner, you know, kind of down in the weeds. So it may not have to do a lot with WTO or any of these transatlantic partnership agreements. But while we're working through those issues and while we're trying to bring Western liberalism to the world, you still have to deal with these things and you still want to make a profit. So if you're practicing law in the area, there's a lot of very interesting things to deal with. I think I'm probably out of time. Oh, I have 2 minutes. Wow. Okay, great. Well, I think one of, you know, some of the things we deal with, for instance, you know, I talk about all the bad things that are happening, but really for the most part, some of our best managers in our region are in Colombia, are in Honduras, and are in Mexico. So there's fabulous, fabulous people that you're working with, and then you owe them your protection because they're working for a foreign company, and so they are somewhat targeted. And you'll see a lot of things, like for instance in Mexico, guys in prison will have a phone bank where they call people at random. And if they get somebody on the phone and can keep them on the phone with threats that there is a group of armed people sitting outside of their home, and if they can keep this guy on the line and keep him scared, they can actually signal people that will go, not armed, there's not an armed army outside the home, but there is a guy ready to pick up a small payment. And so you've got to train even your Mexican employees, you know, if you get this phone call, hang up. Your managers and say, because otherwise they get scared, and you have a responsibility to them, and they may actually have to leave work for about 2 or 3 weeks. Because they're their families, right? And so they said, I'm scared to death. This guy called me up and said that he's got armed men outside of his house, and if I don't pay him $2,000, then he's going to kill my family. And so I got to leave. I can't come back for 3 weeks. And so you've got to train everybody that this is just a scam that they've got in Mexico. Whereas when you go to El Salvador, it's not a scam. All right.
My name is Lynn, and I'm an attorney with Bryan, and while I sit at my sides, I'm going to talk to you a little bit also about something that is down in the weeds. And just to let you know how down in the weeds this is, I'm going to talk about 4 areas of bodies of laws. Entire 2-day conferences are dedicated to aspects of each one of these laws. They are that complicated. I'm going to talk to you about U.S. export control laws. These laws regulate the transfer of stuff from the United States. I'm going to talk about sanctions laws as well, which also have aspects of regulating stuff as they move. These laws are very real to businesses. Yesterday, when I got into Macon, I was on a conference call for 2 hours with a client that bought $2 million worth of inventory. What they were little pieces and parts, sensors, transistors, and things like that. I had to break the bad news to them. They are not allowed to sell them to China. They cannot, under U.S. law, fulfill their contractual obligation. And they are stuck with $2 million worth of inventory. To give you a sense of how these laws work, what I want to try and do is give you an overview of when they apply. So to start off, I want to talk about what is an export. Well, that sounds like a really silly question. An export is I put something on the ship, it goes off the port, it leaves. I'm in Panama Canal, I'm watching it go across the way, it's going across the ocean, it lands somewhere else. The export rules are a lot wrong. They apply not only to the stuff that goes onto the ship or the plane, the goods, they apply to transfers of information. Some people like to think of it as intellectual property. And it doesn't matter whether you put that information into a FedEx envelope or a UPS envelope and ship it overseas. Get two engineers sitting in a room, and you think lawyers like to talk. Engineers love to talk. And what happens is one of those engineers is from a U.S. company, and he's a U.S. citizen. And the other engineer is from a Chinese company, and he's a Chinese national. And the two of them sit in this conference room in the United States, and they start to talk. And they talk technical talk. And as soon as the U.S. engineer opens his mouth and gives application of engineering principles on an aspect of some technology that is related to the building of missiles, the U.S. engineer broke the law. So that's what these rules are about, because that's what an export is. These rules are extraterritorial. They apply not only to U.S. businesses, but they apply to your customers that are overseas. When they buy the U.S. good and they take the U.S. good and they transfer it onto Iran, it's illegal, potentially. It applies to stuff that the foreign customer takes, incorporates into a military aircraft, for example, and sends off to Iran, which is probably going to be. So these rules have a very big impact on trade and on business. And it's important as a law student, as a business professional, to understand and recognize where firms can end up butting up against these provisions. So to start off, because we're at a law school, there are 6 primary provisions concerning U.S. export control regulations. The first is the International Trafficking in Arms Regulations, and folks are probably sitting here going, wow, she's going to talk about gun running? I won't, I promise. It's more than guns. These rules actually come out of the Arms Export Control Act, 22 U.S.C. Section 2778. Take your notes, law students. There might be a quiz afterwards. They are regulated by the Department of State Directorate of Defense Trade Controls. We like to use acronyms in this area of law, so I'm going to refer to these rules as the ITAR. The next set of rules are the Export Administration Regulations. They come out of the Export Administration Act from 1979, which act is now defunct. And so they are held up by presidential executive orders under IEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. So that is 50 U.S.C. Section 1701 at SEC for all of those who take notes. The next 2 set of rules are the Nuclear Regulatory Commission Regulations and the Department of Energy Regulations. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. What these laws apply to are transfers of nuclear technology. It's actually not nuclear weapons. It's the commercial nuclear technology and the stuff for commercial nuclear reactors. It's a very specialized area of law, and they don't have as broad of application as the other provisions. The next set of laws are the Department of the Treasury Office of Foreign Asset Controls Regulations. These rules are U.S. sanctions laws, and we'll talk about them a bit. They regulate transfers of stuff to interesting places like Iran or Cuba. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit briefly about the U.S. anti-boycott laws. There are actually 2 sets of laws. One is in the Internal Revenue Code, Section 999. These penalize businesses for complying with foreign boycotts that the U.S. government doesn't agree with. Primarily, actually, the Arab League's boycott of Israel. And then 15 CFR Part 760, which is in the Export Administration Regulations, which is referred to above, actually penalize people for cooperating in or participating in the boycott. These rules come about because of treaties. So the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Wassenaar Arrangement, so some multilateral or multinational agreements, but they are also here because of U.S. unilateral foreign policy and national security concerns. And that's actually what pervades these rules. It's why the poor client that I had to talk to yesterday is going to lose $2 million in the inventory that they bought. So, I'm going to start off with the International Traffic in Arms Regulations. First of all, because it sounds really great. The eyes are. Second of all, because it is pervasive. The reason that my poor client yesterday can't send anything to China, its stock, is because its stock is regulated by these rules. These rules apply to not only guns, and not only military aircraft and military vessels, but they also apply to commercial satellites and all of the pieces and parts and components that are specially designed to go into all of that kind of stuff. So if you think about a missile and how big it is, and all of the nuts and bolts that go into it, a lot of them are specially made for that missile. And little companies, the wire companies, the fastener companies, the nuts and bolts companies, end up getting regulated by these rules, which is why they are so pervasive. These rules, as I said before, govern not only the transfer of the stuff, the inventory I talked about yesterday, but also transfers of the technology. That's why when those two engineers I described at the beginning get into the room and sit down and talk, and the U.S. engineer opens his mouth and out comes a bunch of technical stuff, as it always happens, he broke the law. Because it's illegal to share information about how not only to make the missile, but how to make the specially designed nut or bolt that goes into the missile. These rules require U.S. companies that export items subject to the ITAR to register with the Department of State. Anybody who actually manufactures stuff, even if they don't export it, also have to register with the Department of State. The reason is the Department of State wants to know who out there is dealing with this stuff. And then there are actually registration requirements for people who broker in these items. And I'm not just talking gun runners, I'm talking to folks who broker the nuts and bolts. So the rules are much bigger than what they sound. They sound really cool, they sound like guns, but to think that a piece of wire are subject to these rules is sort of mind-boggling, but it actually can, at least for now. There are lots of arms embargo countries. China is the biggest. Because China is one of the biggest emerging markets, it is actually arms embargo. The reason is because of the Tiananmen sanctions. It goes back to the Tiananmen Square massacre. And you are not allowed to share any of the items, technology, services with somebody in China that are subject to the ITAR. Next set of rules are the Export Administration Regulations. These are really broad as well. These apply to anything that is commercial, dual use, and certain military items as well. It applies to hardware, software, and technology, both the technical know-how, the data, as well as technical assistance, just like the ITAR. Funny things, this remote control, the EAR apply. The pen you're holding, the EAR apply. The pieces of paper that you have before you, the EAR apply. Bottles of water and drinks, the EAR apply. But just because they apply doesn't necessarily mean you need to have a license. It depends on what you're sending, where you're sending it, who you're sending it to, and what they're going to use it for. And so businesses have to know these things in order to successfully transfer things. Trends in the export control world, the wires and all of those things that I'm talking about. A lot of the things right now, the U.S. government is taking a look at the ITAR and it's saying it's sort of silly to treat a piece of wire just like the gun or the missile it's going into. So what the U.S. government is doing is it is looking at transferring certain items from the ITAR to the EAR. And these are the rulemakings that come out. And what happens as a private practitioner is we got to know everything that's happening. So we read all of these, and then we have clients who call us and ask us all about them. All right, doing business with emerging markets. What do you need to know under these rules? Very quickly, you need to make sure that you know what you're sending, where you're sending it, where it's going to go from the place that you're sending it, and what the end use of the item is. If you distribute products, you need to know your customer's customer. You need to know that it's going to end up in Iran, and you need to ask the question, where is this going to go from here? If I'm selling to a trading company, is it really taking it into inventory? Is it selling it off? If I'm establishing a business overseas, my capital equipment, my manufacturing equipment that Jim talked about, where is that going, and does that require a license for where it's going? And if I'm buying stuff from overseas and I need to send them a drawing to make it, I'm exporting, even though I'm importing the good at the end of the day. U.S. sanctions laws. Sort of change hats for a moment. These are foreign policy driven. 100% they are unilateral. They prohibit dealings with countries such as Iran. They are pervasive. They can apply not only to the products that you are selling, but the money transfers that you get, send, or receive. They can apply to services like hotel services. They are also not only targeting governments such as Iran, but also individuals, entities, and organizations. And you know what? The list that's referred to on here, the SDN list on my slides, there are more than 6,000 people on those slides. By people, I mean individuals, organizations, and entities. So you may be dealing with somebody in Denmark, for example, but if they're on the prohibited list, you're not allowed to deal with them, even though it's in Denmark. These rules are big because everybody's jumped on the bandwagon. For Iran, if you are a listed Japanese company, where the U.S. rules don't apply to you, or at least not, if you're listed on the U.S. stock exchange and you do business with the Iranian government, you have to disclose that in your SEC filings. There are things about these rules that pervade international business. On your application to emerging markets, probably don't want to be setting up business with Iran. It's not the emerging market we're talking about. But please do make sure that when you're setting up your overseas subsidiaries, that they know that they can't be doing business with Iran or any of these other folks as well. It's important. And the last set of rules that I want to touch on are the anti-boycott laws. Because we're in law school, we can talk for a minute about conflicts of law. This is a true conflicts of law situation. When you are doing business in certain countries such as Saudi Arabia has laws that say that you can't do business with Israel. But U.S. law says that if you are a subsidiary of a U.S. company, you may not comply with those laws. And that is a true conflict of laws. Anti-boycott laws, which I touched on before, Section 999, as well as the Export Administration Regulations for the EAR, actually not only prohibit and or penalize such activities, but when it happens and somebody asks you to comply with the laws of Saudi Arabia, you got to report it. You got to tell the U.S. government, even if you don't follow it. So when you're doing an international business and you're a corporate attorney later on, you want to make sure that if you're going to set up something in Saudi Arabia, the last kind of provision you want to put into the agreement is, I will comply with the laws of Saudi Arabia. Because you can end up violating U.S. law, or at least getting yourself into a spot where you are causing your company to have problems with tax penalties, foreign tax credits. Instead, believe it or not, the magic provision is the laws of Saudi Arabia shall apply. So, just a bit of nugget there. Application to emerging markets. What happens with emerging markets is this. I use Saudi Arabia because it's a classic example. But once you get into places like Malaysia and Indonesia, there is sympathy, not by the government so much, well maybe by the governments, but not officially, but there's sympathy for the Arab League's boycott of Israel. So when you're moving into certain emerging markets, you can end up with these kinds of requests, and that thus trigger the reporting requirements and or the penalties or prohibitions if you don't know what you're doing. So that, in a nutshell, is what I wanted to talk about, and I welcome any questions. Thanks so much.
Questions? What a great talk by all three of you, Penelope.
Exactly.
Are y'all ready for some questions? Oh, another question of mine. I think talking about exporting is very, very appropriate nowadays. As you may know, Georgia has had a record export each year. The U.S. has as well, and we're going on that way. How does the law of Saudi Arabia shall apply such that's the problem?
Yeah. So here is what the U.S. Anti-Boycott Laws say. They say that you are not allowed to abide by, participate in, or cooperate with the Arab League's boycott of Israel. So when you enter into an agreement saying that you will comply with the laws of Saudi Arabia with no further caveat, okay? What ends up happening is the laws of Saudi Arabia include provisions concerning compliance with the Arab League's boycott. Saudi Arabia has actually implemented the Arab League's and boycott provisions on Israel. So you have now agreed to abide by those laws. So what you have to do is you have to carve out those provisions, or you can alternatively, and there's lots of creative ways to do this, but you can alternatively agree, gosh, they apply, but that doesn't mean that you're going to actually follow them. So it's a trick, but I use it as, it sounds like a very silly example, but the provisions that we deal in are actually that arcane that folks who don't know what they're doing can end up, businesses that don't know what they're doing can end up getting tripped up in something as simple as that. And that's actually why I used that example. It is something that is very, very relevant, not only if you're dealing with Saudi Arabia, but with any other country that is participating in or cooperating with the Arab League's boycotts, Iraq, Yemen, etc. I picked on Saudi Arabia because it was an easy target.
Quick question, y'all. Do you know what Georgia's #1 export market is? What country? Canada, yes. Just want to mention Canada. Jennifer's going to help me because I'm too lame to wear my glasses up here today on some of this. And going back to my law school days, I can now sympathize with my professors having been all right. No offense.
This is for Ms. Prime. There's two questions. I liked your low-end, high-end approach regarding China. Looking at high-end technology, would you comment on how well China is doing relative to other countries in quote-unquote growing its own IP capabilities?
Well, the big question, obviously, big issue. China's focused very heavily on promoting domestic innovation. It's part of the government policy, with lots of resources behind that. But in terms of really being on the cutting edge of many aspects of technology, they're really not there yet. And some people hypothesize unless they have more economic reforms and have more really market competition to take the innovations to commercialization, that they may not move in that direction anytime soon.
And their second question is, China do you feel China inadvertently is heavily educating its future leaders in the U.S. given our obvious cultural differences, is China unintentionally, quote unquote, diluting its culture and creating a subclass of U.S. educated business leaders that will have material freedoms, expectations that China is not yet prepared to satisfy? I.e., are there going to be future problems with an education based in the U.S.?
Well, people have been, from China, have been educated in the U.S. and around the world since Deng Xiaoping, really. If you remember, when he came to the States, he said, okay, so how many do you want? We'll send a whole, as many students as you want. So that influence has existed for quite some time. I think the more we go to China and the more Chinese people come here, the better. That it raises the level of understanding and may influence their expectations perhaps, but ours as well. I think the opposite is more of an issue that we do have deep misunderstandings of each other, and that's what we need to work on overcoming. And so, the more that Chinese people can come here and study, and the more that we can go there, the less likely we're going to be in conflict in the future.
If anyone doesn't want to light read, I just finished Restless Empire, which is a fascinating 250-year history of China, the last 250 years in the diplomatic service. So put on your summer reading list. We're going to go now to a question about the Emerald Isle of Ireland, which I must remind people Dublin was founded by the Vikings. Please give an example of a high-tech service Ireland exports, other than Guinness. No, I didn't get that. High-tech from Ireland.
What, in terms of services? Or
high-tech services, the question.
services or
IT services.
yeah, it's really IT services, but more than call centers. I mean, Ireland started at the call center level, but they've upgraded their capabilities, and companies have stayed in Ireland and upgraded within Ireland what they do in terms of IT services.
Okay.
And that started because of the specific tax benefits that you got for being there.
Yes, that's correct. Plus the education levels. English. There was a lot of things that
This is for Ms. Van Buren. Okay, so they're kind of looking for what are the penalties, how is the actual enforcement in relation to, for example, when Boeing and L'Oreal go to China and fix the staging of their international ballistic missiles, which I believe are now targeted there. What's supposed to happen, what actually happens, kind of why, what are the kind of implications of that?
Great question. So I'm going to answer in a general sense, and then if you want to talk with me afterwards about the Boeing L'Oreal matter, enforcement matter, I'm happy to talk in more detail. They're actually both strict liability civil penalties, so it actually doesn't even matter if you know what the rules are. If you send something unlawfully and violate any one of the rules that I talked about, other than Section 999, which is actually imposition of tax penalties, you are strictly liable. Actual penalty amounts for strict liability range from $250,000 per violation, or twice the value of the transaction, whichever is greater, to over $1 million per violation. And when you violate these rules, what ends up happening is there is something called stacking. So if I send one thing out of the U.S. unlawfully without the proper export license, I have to fill out paperwork when I send it out. And when I fill out the paperwork, I'm obviously not going to put on it that I needed a license. So I have two violations, one for sending the thing and one for filling out the paperwork improperly. There are also criminal penalties for the violations. They range up to $1 million per violation. There are up to 30 years imprisonment for individuals who turn around and participate in the violations, and people actually do go to jail for these things. and executives are actually fined for participating in them. On the criminal side, there is a mens rea requirement, and the standard is willful or knowingly, but there, what the government does have to prove is that somebody knew something about the law and therefore knew that what they were doing was not appropriate. Frankly, having done a number of investigations, it's very easy for the government to approve that if they want to, because there's always somebody out there who sat and listened to me and has written an email that has said, you know, are we really allowed to do this? There's a little thing called U.S. export control laws. Are you sure we could send this? And that's enough.
We got 3 more questions. We'll try to get through them, keep on time. This is for Jim. Intellectual property is one of your greatest assets. Before you begin business in the country, do you have protocols to file your patents, trademarks, and copyrights before entry to avoid trolls? And I presume they're not talking about the ones that hide under bridges and scare the rest away.
That's right. Yes. So we're pretty active globally. For filing the trademark, that's important, and you do that even if you're not in that country, right? Because you've got a lot of civil law countries where folks can file your trademark before you're even there, and then we'll try to license it back to you. The patent issue is a complex issue because, as I said before, you got a lot of secret sauce, so you don't really publicize that through the patent. You will keep that as a trade secret as best you can. And that's a challenge because we were dealing in China right now where we had a trade secret walked out the door with an engineer. The engineer went to work for a competitor. The competitor then patented that and is now suing us for patent infringement in China. Wow. But we are seeing, but it is getting better in China as far as patent protection and patent enforcement. And it's a lot faster and it's a lot cheaper than it is in the United States. But I think also when you look at we're working in a global space, so everything's moving around quite a bit. And one of the interesting aspects right now when you look at patent infringement is you start to pick your jurisdiction based on where you're going to get the best bang for your buck. Because before we were thinking it's got to be U.S. But really you might be smarter doing it in Dusseldorf, Germany, because of some of the rules they've got there. And if you're looking at low cost and where stuff is being made, a $50,000 legal fee for a patent infringement case in China that can be done in 5 months is pretty attractive as well.
Can you comment on those who say the following factors could throw world trade into a crisis, i.e. the mortgage crisis in the U.S., China's banking situation, and Europe's currency crisis?
It's mine. Well, any of those things, of course, have already caused a lot of problems in terms of global trade. But those kinds of things, from the economist's point of view, we think of them more as business cycles, short-term kinds of impacts, which from a business point of view, short-term can put you under, I understand. I understand that. But what we tend to focus on more are the long-run structural strengths of an economy and how they can get through those kinds of traumatic situations. So Ireland is an example. You may have noticed in some of the charts, I mean, Ireland has done very, very well, but of course, with the financial crisis and especially the problems in EU, it's a disaster by some of these measures. But the reality is the underlying strength of the economy is still there. They have very good engineers, they have this whole manufacturing base, they have this IT base. The question for Ireland is, can they recover soon enough so they don't lose that base, right? Because I was in Singapore this summer and met a family that was there, and And the husband had been in Ireland for a number of years, but in 2008, he moved to Singapore. Right? And to the extent that people will leave because the business and the activity is somewhere else, that will erode Ireland's strength. But nonetheless, the fact that they have it together and they know how to do it really does matter. So these temporary financial crises and problems can be overcome.
Just a word on that. Police, about 3 years ago, they opened the Consulate General in Atlanta. That was the first new Irish mission of that sort since, gosh, I think 40 years. So the ties between Georgia and Ireland are growing, which is significant as well. Last question, I think we're going to make it to our time. BDS, I'm not familiar with that term, boycott, divest, sanction, proposed boycott to Israel because of settlement policy in the West Bank with U.S. anti-boycott laws. Why?
So here's the way that the U.S. anti-boycott laws work. The anti-boycott laws are actually really broad. They prohibit U.S. companies that are under control of foreign subsidiaries from complying with foreign boycotts with which the U.S. government has decided that it does not agree. So, right now, the target is the Arab League's boycott of Israel because the U.S. government does not agree with the Arab League's boycott. Other boycotts, the U.S. government is either indifferent to or it actually signs on to it, like the UN arms embargoes against places like Libya, or against, or on, and actually the U.S. government promoted it, UN policies concerning Iran. So the anti-boycott rules, if you actually sit down and read them, they don't say Israel anywhere in them. But for something like where Israel says, well, we're not going to buy stuff from other places, it doesn't necessarily mean that the anti-boycott laws apply. Right now, their application really is limited to the Arab League's boycott of Israel. And it's the one boycott that it's out there that the U.S. government has decided, and it decided back in the late 70s and early 80s, that it really had an issue with it, and it was going to do something about it.
I think we're on time.